having me here. It's quite a delight, slightly anxious. But part of the reason is because it's a really wide-ranging subject that I've had to condense into a mere 18 minutes. I don't know if you've read the bio. They're always tedious things to read, but if you did, you may have probably got an inkling of what it is I do. Good luck, because I don't. I'm supposedly an artist and a writer. And that doesn't really cover what it is I do, because what I also am is actually a prankster of sorts. And the talk that I'm giving today, I'm going to be talking about the brain as unread library. And what I really mean by this is the fact that almost everything we know is really unknown, and I'll be going into this a bit more. And I'm going to start by describing why I'm particularly interested in the brain and why I'm interested in forms of knowledge and how inaccessible they really are. And it's because I'm doing a 10-year project on, ostensibly, and this really helps with funding, by the way, it's supposedly about the history of knowledge and libraries all across the world. So for 10 years I'm traveling around the world, looking at libraries, and I'm writing 5 books. This is the first. And I'm also making a film in 5 parts. And what's the film about? I go to libraries all over the world and I interview people who are at the forefront of saving knowledge, also who are responsible for the destruction of knowledge and cultural heritage. So as you can imagine, a lot of this information can't even be shown. There are people who've done illegal things just so that they can save knowledge and books and information. Some of the stuff concerns books and things that are still banned in Singapore, so I can't even talk about them here. But nevertheless, I don't really know the point of this project, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I do know why I'm so obsessed with the idea of vast libraries and disappearing knowledge. Part of it has also got to do very much with the idea of the disappearing manuscript. Sorry, I'm just going to jump a moment. Can we dim the light slightly? Because you won't be able to see the color very well. Sorry. I'm always plagued by technical issues. I find they are sort of counterproductive. Okay, this is actually a page that I found in a library. Every time they open it, it degrades a bit more. It's a disappearing manuscript. You can't even see the text anymore. You can barely see the A, it's faint red A, it's the part of the illuminated page. No one knows what it's about. They keep it like a treasure. It's actually a metaphysical object. What's an unreadable page doing in a library? And almost every library has this. They have artifacts. They are really now artifacts that are unreadable. Why have them? Similar, I suppose, in a way that our brains have information that we have no use of. I don't know why I still remember the lyrics to Backstreet Boys songs. I can't stand the Backstreet Boys. And we imagine our brains to be vast libraries, beautiful repositories, archives waiting to be explored. At least when you reach my age, you assume that you've got 40 years of information. Or maybe it's just blank stacks or bodies of knowledge that are orderly placed on shelves. But in reality, and this is what's actually how we imagine our brains are libraries without borders. They are not bounded by shelves or rooms. And yet, at the same time, here's the conundrum. We don't know our brains enough. We can't possibly know our brains enough. And I'm not just saying this as a mere artist. I actually studied neuroscience, taught me some neuroscience to figure this out. Our brains are vastly unknowable, and yet the very thing that's unknown uses itself as a tool for study. In other words, the brain knows itself by studying itself. Conflict of interest. And because we are unknowable even to ourselves, we are therefore unreadable. And when I say unreadable, I really actually mean this. We start off with the infancy, almost like an acorn, a leaf from an acorn, and that actually, by the way, is how the human, the central nervous system first develops, the primitive brain. And we grow and we assume as adults we've gained a certain amount of information, but really actually we are incredibly idiotic in almost every field that is outside our own. And when I say idiotic, it's because we cannot admit to ignorance. And a big part or point of this talk is about the importance of ignorance. Admitting ignorance, admitting it is, I use the term unreadable or unknowable is a gentler, euphemistic way to say we don't know. And as young people, I'm sure this is the sort of thing that you're always uncomfortable about. How do you ask a question? Does it expose your ignorance? When you ask a question in class, do you get mocked? Do you get sniggered at? This is something that's always at the backs of our minds. Whether it's an actual sensation or not, we do really feel the onus is on us to be smarter or appear smarter than we really are. And this is why our brains do what they do when they record. They interpret, and the reason we interpret is because we do not, when I say we, I mean our brains, do not know. Our brains cannot trust information and therefore layer information or layer raw data with interpretation. And what it then does is erase what it assumes is irrelevant. How do our brains decide what is irrelevant? We don't know, our brains don't tell us. And most of the choices that our brains make are, as I said, completely relevant. It's why I remember those stupid Backstreet Boys lyrics, amongst other things I don't really want to mention. This is from the 80s and 90s, okay? But I can't remember really important information. The disorder of choices that our brains make is actually very, very interesting. Now, when our brains erase, there are gaps, and therefore our brains confabulate. Confabulate means lie. It makes up stuff. And therefore, most of our memories are fraudulent, unreliable, and completely muddied. You're kind of wondering what the point of all of this is, right? Well, there's a point, don't worry. Is it a problem? Thank you for saying so, because it isn't. Thank you so much. And the reason it's not a problem is because when we have gaps or lacunae, and we have these, our brains panic and tend to fill in gaps with information, irrelevant and sometimes fraudulent information. And this filling in the blanks actually is what we call the creative leap. And that's why I can be an artist, because I'm a liar. I'm a very adept liar. I'm really good at confabulating with creativity and a certain amount of, hopefully, aesthetic work. And that's why I'm so happy that our brains are such crappy devices. When we talk about, and this brings me to the mechanism of art making, and I'm talking about this is SOTA after all. You know, of course, that whether you look at theatre, cinema, most frameworks, this is how we construct narrative, especially literature, and I'm a big lit buff. We construct or reconstruct. Now, if you remember the earlier talk about sampling, that's what I mean by reconstruct. We pull information from different bodies of knowledge. Whether it's fiction or fact is not really important, because it's all stitched together for one aim, which is the suspension of disbelief. To convince the viewer or reader, or the person who's interacting, the audience, to convince them of your premise, to convince them of your narrative. And what we do, this seductive suspension, is actually an emotional and intuitive connection as well as an intellectual one. And it's one that relies on, as I said already, the fact that we can only float into these unreal or fantastical realms if we are grounded in reality. So all lies have to have a certain element of or appearance of truth. And that's why art is so effective, because it is more just enough in what we call reality to be able to create a realistic fantasy. And that's why this fictive play of art, music, literature is actually just beautiful lies. Now, the reason I bring this up is because for the first 10 years as an artist, I discovered that one of the most effective literary devices is that of the nom de plume. But being an artist, I took it a little further and created a personality. Let me introduce you to S. Raul, who is, actually was, because I think I killed him if I'm not wrong. Yes, he tripped over an artwork of mine and died. Anyway, it broke his neck. I think it was negotiating space in a cultural context. And S. Raul was a writer, a historian, a scientist, especially a neuroscientist, and also a scapegoat. And why scapegoat? Because first of all, he was not female, which meant he could be taken seriously. As a writer and as someone who constructed very, very complex narratives, I was getting a bit sick of always being called the girl, who, and being always challenged about everything and I'd be asked the same basic questions at every talk. And the moment I put up this paper tiger, it's just me with the paper moustache, obviously. But the moment I put up this paper tiger, the work was taken seriously. So I would present my own work as if made by S. Raul. I would be the booth girl. And what happened then was that I would be asked these questions about the work. So it shifted the spotlight away from the persona of the artist. So the lie became more credible because the creator of the artwork or of the scientific work was not there. And we could then, therefore, the viewer could create a romance in their minds. So for example, The main work I want to show you was called The Tuning Fork of the Mind, and it was shown at the Singapore Biennale, but it wasn't actually an artwork really, because in the run-up to the Biennale, what happened was that there was a lot of the usual mainstream media nonsense about contemporary art is so ugly, contemporary art is just unnecessarily controversial, it just muddies the waters, in other words, it's not suitable for the masses, because apparently the masses can't think for themselves. And I think what really was the last straw was when I read a half-page article in the mainstream media, not naming names, which was titled, actually I can read the title, it gives it away, but why not? There has been no beautiful art since Michelangelo's David. And I said, oh really? When you're faced with a ridiculous statement, what you can do, and this is again a literary device, is to take it to its logical conclusion, thereby exposing its absurdity. And I said, okay, alright. Ezra was going to prove neuroscientifically, using actual neuroscience, that contemporary art is not only ugly, it's dangerous, it's malicious, and it will derange your brain. So the tuning fork of the mind involved many things. It was an entire museological setup. So you walk in and you think you're in a museum setup, you completely forget you're in a biennale. Which is bizarre if you think about it. I don't know why people got conned by that. And one of the things you do is try on a machine. It's just that ugly box there, with bulbs that don't really work and flicker, and it looks like a really outdated machine. And if you put on the electrodes, it measures the brain waves that have been damaged by overexposure to contemporary art and plays it back as sound. And there's all this free sounds from the internet. So it's like stuff like, toilet flushing, dog barking, crickets, the usual sound. But you'd be surprised how many people, because that's the moment when the hoax breaks. But a surprising number of people believed it. I even had one man get really distressed and say, does that mean I'm mentally ill? And then I had to sort of, because I was the booth girl, I wasn't as sure, I had to sort of explain that this was an outdated scientific work and so on. Now, the machine was part of it. There was also a display, there was a film. This is a still from the film set. The X-rays, but of course I didn't have access to actual X-rays, and I couldn't do a real brain dissection, so I dissected a plastic brain, and that X-ray actually they just photocopies from books. So you don't really need, again, but the thing was people believed it. There's just enough credible looking evidence for people to believe the lie. And the tools here actually were things like, they were very domestic objects, and there's a very feminist aspect to this. I always use things that are denigrated or disregarded as being domestic or feminine, because somehow they're not seen as having credibility. So I use things like crochet hooks. In fact, I also noticed a science paper proving that art arranges the brain. And interestingly enough, this artwork was invited and shown at the International Congress of Global Neuroscientists. I'm not making some, this is true. And I had Nobel laureate neuroscientist trying on this machine, reading the stuff, and one guy, I'm not going to mention who he was, he's a Nobel Prize winner, looking at the display and saying, oh, what an exquisite collection of 19th century lobotomy tools. They were rusty crochet hooks. And if you've seen the 19th century lobotomy tool, they used to lobotomize with bit too much, but you should actually look it up. It looks surprisingly like a crochet hook. But anyway, and all the stuff was picked up at the Sunai Road Flea Market and places like that. So they're very topical as well. They're very immediate relationship. So there's a romantic relationship I have with objects, but at the same time, this solid scientific work, the artwork had enough, and by then I'm someone who flunked science in school. There was enough neuroscientific work in this for the theory to actually be readable by recognized renowned neuroscientists. And then finally, eventually the paper was peer-reviewed and published. It's just a hoax, it's not true. Contemporary art actually does not derange the brain, as far as I know. And so yeah, this is an example of the display. As I mentioned, that's a plastic brain there. But it was shot, when I did the film, it's really low-tech, so it looks like a film shot in a lab. It's probably early 20th century, you can't really tell. It's actually just, there's a piece of acrylic with Vaseline smeared over it in front of the lens. It's all really, really low-tech. But that's what adds to the seeming reality of it, or the truth of it. The appearance of truth is really seductive, and we want to be seduced by that. And that's why people like me have a job, by the way. So where does that bring us? To this great game. The great game, after all, as I mentioned before, and this is why I'm an artist. I can escape the confines of my field. I actually don't read books about art. I shouldn't say this because I'm an art theory lecturer, but I'm more interested in fields outside of art. I'm fascinated by literature, of course, and I'm interested in the arts, of course. But I am much much more interested in what's happening in the forefront of science. For instance, I'm interested in quantum physics, I'm interested in multiple things. I'm also interested in things that are completely discredited and outdated. I'm fascinated that we have so much knowledge that we can throw it away. And all of this is carried in, and connected through humor and, of course, literary irony. Why literary irony is so important, and this is something I can't emphasize enough, is because you can leapfrog or make cognitive or creative leaps, but you can stitch it together with the one thing that connects us all, which is the sneaky suspicion that things are not always what they seem. And literary irony is a great device to sort of bring the audience into your joke. So you're not laughing at them, but you've included them in this joke. And that's why I want to talk about how these gaps in comprehension will always be more interesting, because language is completely flawed. Art can create mindworms like songs create earworms. Art it can burrow into your head and make you feel a little bit disconnected, dissatisfied, and that's actually really, really important. All our bodies of knowledge, like libraries, attempt to order themselves, to shelve themselves, and I think this is a grave mistake. Creatively speaking, of course. This is an image from one of the libraries where they digitize books. To digitize a book, you have to slice the spine so you can flatten the pages completely, which means you destroy the book. So to save knowledge, you destroy the object. So an accountant who worked in the library was so distressed, she would collect these sliced up books and make artwork out of them. She's an accountant. I want to end with these last two slides, because for me, I think, and this is really important, we can order information, we can put everything neatly on a shelf. Our brains will not allow us to be perfectly precise. Our brains don't allow us to be orderly. There's nothing wrong with disorder, there's nothing wrong with ignorance. It's the way you choose, what you stitch together that becomes important. And we can endow the most mundane objects, like this little coca cup piece, with a mystery and a romance and a beauty. And we can talk about very large ideas in miniature. And that's what I want to leave you with. I hope you enjoyed my sort of how would I say it? It's actually a plea for ignorance and a plea for celebrating our inability to be perfect, precise, and orderly. Thank you.